Welcome everybody to our webinar on boundaries today. And I hope this is really going to be informative, and I hope it's going to help you in those areas that you need to put down, the boundaries that need to be put down, and to actually recognize where your boundaries aren't so great and that you can make work with it. So as we can see on our little opening slide, boundaries is really about what is mine and what is not mine, and where that overlap is, not only in our marriages, with our children, but in every relationship that we have in our lives. And many times we've often felt frustrated in our interpersonal relationships, right, with our spouse, family, friends, or children, or our work environment, because there's something going on, and we feel this internal conflict. How many times do we often feel like we're just carrying too much stuff on our shoulders? It's like there's just too much of a load. Or we feel that people are taking advantage of us, and we feel that internal frustration or even the pain related to that. And we find it hard to say no, even when we're overstretched, right? We don't know where to put the limit down. And then also we struggle to communicate, what we need from others. And that is the first problem, because if we can't communicate what we need, it's very hard for us to start putting down the boundaries that we need to put down. So we can see that boundaries will affect every sphere of our life. And as a counselor, this is often one of the major problems. People come to you with relational issues, with personal issues, and it's often related to boundaries, where your own boundaries aren't set properly. You don't understand where your limits are. You don't understand what you need. You don't understand what you need from others. And so it's a very important area to clarify. So if we look at boundaries, what they simply are is that they protect our property and everything that pertains to us. So it's just like our home needs a fence to protect that perimeter, right? And to protect it from intruders or from those that are not supposed to be coming in. We need to protect our property, and we need to define where those barriers are, or the limits are on our property. So I received this this morning on a group, and I thought it was quite appropriate. So I thought I'm going to actually just pop this up. So if we look at boundaries, it's really what is mine and what is not mine. So some of the things that are out of our control are the actions of others, the past, opinions of others, what happens around us, the outcome of our efforts, the future, how others take care of themselves. And not all of these are boundary issues, but a lot of it pertains to boundaries. So what do other people think of me? And that is stuff I cannot control. I have no say over, because boundaries is pretty much what is my responsibility and what isn't my responsibility. So if we look at what is in our control, so that would be in our property line, in our fence, would be our thoughts and our actions, how I speak to myself, how I spend my free time, what I give my energy to, the goals that I set, how I handle challenges, and then also the boundaries that we set for ourselves and for others in our life. So what we need to remember about boundaries, so I've just put this picture up to show you the 3 types of boundaries that we get, okay? And what we need to remember with each boundary, we can have a gate. So when we look at the rigid boundary, we can see it's a very tight circle. The lines represent the gate that we can open or close according to what we want to let in or out. Okay, so I'm going to explain these a little bit more. I'm just going to explain to you what they are. The diffuse boundary is we let too much in and we totally overcrowd ourselves. So you'll see the little dot in the middle, that would be you. You let way too much in. All your gates are open. You haven't put any limits down. You haven't said, this is how far I'm willing to go. And so we very much feel overwhelmed, overcrowded in that space that we have. Now, your clear boundary is like a sieve. So you're going to let through the stuff that can go through or that you want to let in. and it's going to keep out the others. You know, when we bake a cake, the chunks of flour or the chunks of whatever will stay behind and the fine flour will go through. And this is pretty much, you know, what our boundaries should look like. Okay, so boundaries, obviously, we can renegotiate them once we feel safer. So, for example, if your home has been broken into, right, there's this intense feeling of violation. Somebody's come into your space, they've violated that space, your safety, your peace has been compromised in that place. And so, part of the trauma response, right, is then to want to close off everything. So, it's the same as if we've been hurt by somebody. You know, we want to close up our hearts, we want to protect because we don't feel safe. And so, then we need to do that. So, for example, in a marriage, if your spouse has hurt you or somebody has said something that's hurtful, you're not going to immediately want to feel like being intimate with them, for example, because you are hurt. So now you close up. Only when you feel safe again can you actually open up to that person. So you put that barrier up. So I remember when my mom was attacked in her home in Johannesburg, that feeling of there was no protection in home, there was an alarm, there wasn't what needed to be there, and somebody came in, even though they were somebody that she trusted, so it was the garden boy, came in and he proceeded to do whatever he did to the house and to her. And after that, there was the sense of violation, the sense of not being safe. And so what you want to do is you want to put alarms up, you want to put higher walls up, you want to put electric fencing up because now you need to feel safe. And that is often what we do in relationships when something's been hurt, broken, or violated. So often we don't understand our own limits, so therefore we don't know how to put a limit down for other people, because I don't know how much I'm going to allow in or out myself. So that is the first thing that we need to define for ourselves, right? Because unhealthy boundaries cause a lot of emotional pain. They cause a lot of stress and physical illness in our bodies. They can create dependency, depression, you know, all sorts of things that are not helpful for us. So it is really up to us to establish those boundaries. And if you've been a victim of abuse, right, it's going to be really hard for you to establish boundaries, especially if you were violated in childhood and that stuff has come through your years where you've, you know, grown up in that environment. And if you're in a helpless state and you've been injured, it's very easy to be exploited by other people. And if you've never healed from that in adulthood, the same thing is going to be happening. So victimization, right, can be verbal, it can be physical, it can be sexual. And if you look at a lot of the kind of work that I'm involved in as well, is there can be satanic ritual abuse. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes that we need to be aware of when we set our boundaries. And obviously the damage from that affects the character of the person or that child, and then they grow up with spiritual, emotional, and cognitive distortions that they need to first clarify before they know what the boundary can be. And also, obviously, if you come from an abusive relationship, sometimes it's hard to leave that relationship, and you're going to need help and you're going to need support to get out of that and actually put those boundaries down. So, whenever you feel an internal feeling or a conflict, right, and you feel that conflict inside, it means there's a change that needs to happen, whether it be in your relationships, in your work, whatever it may be. You've got this internal push and pull. You've got to ask yourself what needs to change. Something's got to change. Okay, so just coming back to the circles. So a rigid boundary is what we put up when we've been hurt. When we've had a diffuse boundary, okay, also, and we've allowed too much in, and we get angry and go, that's it, I'm not doing this anymore, I've had enough. And then we close off the circle, we make it very tight, very rigid. We don't let the good in, and we don't let the bad out either. So we're not in a very healthy situation. The gate can be renegotiated. Once we're feeling better, we can decide how much we want to open that gate. Once we recover from this rigid boundary and we start to feel safer around people, we can work towards the clear boundary where we're really in control of that gate. We're in control of what we're letting in. We're letting in the good. We're keeping out the bad, or we're letting out the bad, and keeping in that good. So you need to also just have a look at these circles and decide, what is my boundary currently? What does it look like? Okay, so our next slide is just to have a quick run through what is a boundary. What does it look like? So it's an invisible property line, and it's responsibility, right? It's like where your property begins and somebody else's ends, right? If you look at our little bed there, this is mine and that's yours, and this is the overlap. Okay, in the spiritual world, our boundaries really define our soul and help us guard it and maintain it, right? We know what the word says, that out of the heart are the well springs of life. So we need to guard our hearts, and we need to keep it with all diligence. So it's the same with our property lines. And then also, boundaries define what is me and what is not me. I need to know what is mine to own and take responsibility for. If I don't know where that ends, where that property line is, how do I know how to guard it, right? And if you don't know where your property line is, that's dangerous, right? Because other people can come in there because there is no trespassing sign, or there isn't a fence up. And you're not going to know if that person that's coming in is safe or not, right? So it's very important to have that. And if you think emotionally and spiritually, God created a world where we all live within ourselves, right? We are responsible for everything that makes us up, what God's given us, the stuff He's given us in our spirit. And if we're not shown or taught, if we're not shown the parameters or taught the wrong parameters, right, we are often in for much pain in our walk with God and in our walk with people. So really, we cannot take responsibility for other people, right? Because that's other control. We can only control ourselves and the limits that we have. So what does a boundary look like? We continue with that 2 and 4, right? We are responsible to others and for ourselves, right? Galatians 6 verse 2 says, we bear one another's burdens, so we fulfill the law of Christ, right? If we deny ourselves to do for others what they cannot do, right, that's a sacrificial love. So that's a responsibility to somebody, okay? So if we need to take care of somebody that cannot take care of themselves, say we've got an aging parent or a spouse or whatever, that is a healthy sacrificial love, right? But if we're doing something and taking care of people in the sense that we are enabling them when they should be doing it themselves, that is not the right kind of responsibility to take. And then also, we all have our own responsibilities that we carry, right? The Bible says, for each one shall bear his own load, Galatians 6 verse 5. That is what we are responsible for, right? We all have a knapsack, and sometimes what we show kids, you take that bag and you put all the stones in and you say, right, this is what you're carrying. And if you're carrying too much, the bag gets heavier and heavier, and the only way to lighten the load is to take the stones out. So when we're taking on too much, then that bag becomes very heavy. And so we carry our knapsack that's ours for every day. But when we start carrying what other people should carry, that becomes a boulder, right? It becomes a huge burden on our shoulders. And especially if it hasn't been shared, okay? So good in and bad out, right? We need to keep in the things that will nurture us, and the things that will harm us, we need to keep out, right? And these boundaries really also help us just to guard our hearts, right? Matthew 7 verse 6 says, don't give what is holy to dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, because they will trample on them. So our boundaries really guard our treasures. That's what's ours. That's what's in our heart. That's what's in our spirit. So that people don't steal that from us. Okay, so if we have bad on the inside, we need to open those boundaries, right, to let the good in. Okay, like we spoke earlier, fences need gates. All right, and so boundaries are not supposed to be walls. right, that just keep everything out, because we do need the good to help us. So if there's pain or there's sin, we need to open up for others to help us, or we need to open up to God to confess. So we need to get that out. And, people can be life-giving to us. Safe people can bring that life that we need. And we need to be in community with others. So when it comes to others and community, our lines can be permeable. It's like that clear boundary. We can let people in to help us. And obviously, it's going to be good people that we've recognized are safe, and they're good to us. So abuse will keep the bad in and the good out. So those boundaries especially need to be reversed. Then let's just look, at what God says about boundaries. So the concept of boundaries really comes from the nature of God, right? He defines himself as a distinct and a separate being. He's responsible for himself. He doesn't expect us to take responsibility for him. He differentiates himself from the other. He tells us who he is not. There are boundaries within the Trinity. They all are one, but they have different roles. They have different functions, yet they are one. And God also limits what he allows in his yard, right? There are consequences in his word. And the gates of his boundaries open and close appropriately, right? He's always open to us. We can always come to him, but his word really clearly defines, what he allows. So if we look at the Bible, it can be seen as a book about relationship, God to the people to God, and people to each other. And really, the bottom line of the word is love. So if you want to know how others should be loving you and how you should be loving, we just need to look at the word, right? And when we have boundary issues, especially if it comes from the past, our childhood, it's really hard for us to love the way God expects us to love. So if we need to respect others' boundaries and they need to respect our boundaries, God has laid that foundation also. He leaves work for us to do that only we can do, right? He allows us to experience the consequences of our behavior so we will change, right? 2 Peter 3 verse 9. He respects our no, right? He doesn't try to control us or nag us into doing something. He's a giver. He gives us a choice. That's how he created us. So until we can own our boundaries with God, because remember, we also need to be authentic, right? We can't change them and we can't allow him to work through them. So even with others, if it's hidden, if it's not communicated, it's hidden, right? So how do people even know where our limits are? And how do we know where others' limits are if they don't, put that out for us to understand that? So God also respects us to respect his boundaries, right? It's his right and freedom to say no to us. How many of us have experienced that? Why is there a delay? Why is God saying no? Why isn't this happening? He knows what's best for us, right? And that's kind of his boundary that he's putting down to protect us because we are his children. If you're in a real relationship with him, you need to respect that freedom that God has also in that choice over your life, right? And when we expect that God has to do something, then we're testing that, right? We're testing that freedom. And sometimes we are angry because he doesn't do, what we want him to do, and God is who he is, right? Like I said, he knows what's best for us. So he wants us to respect his no. He wants us to be still and wait, like his word sometimes says, even if we don't know what the outcome is. And he doesn't want us to be passive. We can speak to him. We can tell him what our needs are. We can ask him the questions that we need to ask because he can change his mind. It's in the word. And many in the word embraced God's freedom, respected his boundaries, and they deepened their relationship with God. Look at David, Job, Abraham, Paul, even Jesus, right? So these are our examples. So to set boundaries is not a unbiblical principle. God actually expects us to know what's good for us. And so some of the common questions, that we have with regards to boundaries, especially from a Christian background, we often find it very hard to put boundaries down because we're not quite sure what is the right thing to do. And we've received all these messages, in the word turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. But, when is that too much? So what are some of the questions we ask? Can I set limits and still be a loving person? What are legitimate boundaries? What if someone is upset or hurt by my boundaries? How do I answer someone who wants my time, my love, my energy, or money? Why do I feel guilty or afraid when I want to set boundaries? How do boundaries relate to submission? And aren't they selfish? So must I always be giving everything of myself to others? So hopefully we can have a look at some of those questions. Right, so it's pretty obvious that, we wouldn't want our boundaries violated, right? So why do we allow it? Why don't we uphold or enforce our boundaries? So yes, 4 reasons: fear of rejection, and ultimately to be abandoned. So it's almost that loss of that relationship. Fear of confrontation. We don't like conflict. We don't want to face people and have to do that. Guilt. Can I do this? What will happen if I do? Is it the right thing to do? And then often, if we were not taught healthy boundaries in childhood, how are we going to set those boundaries, right? So awareness is the first step in establishing and enforcing your boundaries, is understanding why you don't set them. It's understanding, why do I feel guilty? Why wasn't I, where did it go wrong? Why am I not able to understand how to set boundaries? So it's looking at all these things and then dealing with those areas in your life. So when it comes to boundaries, there are several myths, right? So some of the common boundary myths. And remember, what is a myth, right? It's fiction that looks like truth. So in the light of the questions, right, we looked at, let's have a look at what the myths are. We know that the enemy gets us to fall, for his lies by always adding an element of truth to something, right, to bring doubt or to cause confusion. So myth number 1, if I set boundaries, I'm being selfish, right? So appropriate boundaries increase our ability to care for others, right? We have more capacity. And there's a distinction between selfishness and stewardship. Selfishness has to do with a fixation on our own wishes and desires to the exclusion of our responsibility to love others. Okay, so that's what selfishness is. We're not selfish if we have a balance in our life of looking to God to meet our needs or loving others as God directs us. We are our own responsibility, okay, and other people are their own responsibility. So it is not selfish to know where those boundary lines are. And then the stewardship, if we look at are boundaries a sign of disobedience? Okay, it's still on the first one. So yeah, we're stewards of the life that God has given us, right? And we are important to him. So it's necessary to steward that well, and that's also linked to our time and how much we're going to give. Okay, so myth number 2, people are sometimes criticized, right, especially in Christian circles, if they don't take on every responsibility that's presented to them. A lot of times you see this with people working in the church. I've experienced this when I've had to counsel people working in the church, where they take on more and more and more, and it affects their family life, it affects their health, but they're doing it for the ministry. So we need to understand even the lie in that, okay? So the truth is that a lack of boundaries can be a sign of disobedience. It can be ours or others that push our boundaries, right? God wants to direct our lives. People that are shaky in their ligaments are often compliant on the outside, but inside they're rebellious and resentful for the things that they need to do. They would like to say no, but they're afraid to say no because of what others may think. If we say yes to God or anyone else when we really mean no, we move into a position of compliance, and also we move out of authenticity, right? Then we're not being authentic, which is the same as lying, right? Others may not guess our heart, so we have a false sense of security, but God knows our heart. If we cannot say no, then we can't say yes, right? Authentically. So we must say yes out of a heart of love. When our motive is fear, right, then we're not in love. Okay, we mustn't give reluctantly, but be a cheerful giver. So I think that is also one of those areas we all think that we can put on the mask and we can say, yes, I'm going to do this, it's okay, but inside we're seething. It's not authentic. And God will look at that. He will look at your heart because He knows what's there. So giving reluctantly and under compulsion both involve fear, either of a real person or a guilty conscience. Okay, these motives can really exist side by side. And with love, there's no fear in love, right? Because perfect love casts out fear. So having a no helps us to clarify, to be honest, and to tell the truth about our motives. And we can't do this if we have a fearful heart. So myth number 3, if I set boundaries, I will be hurt by others. So people might be angry when we set these boundaries, right? They might attack us or withdraw from us, and so we will be hurt. So we become more reluctant. Again, it's the relationship that might be lost in the process, right? So God never gave us the power to change the way other people are going to respond towards us because of our no. Okay, some are going to welcome it. If it's an authentic and it's a healthy relationship, they're going to welcome your no. If not, they're going to hate it. Okay. And so sometimes this also will then tell you, are these good people to have in my life if it's hard for them to accept no, what's good for me? Okay, myth number 4, myth number 5. 4, if I set boundaries, I will hurt others. So we often see boundaries as an offensive weapon. So if a boundary is used as a weapon, it's not a good thing. If your spouse or your child or somebody's done something to you, and now you decide, no, I'm not going to speak to them again. I'm not going to allow them to come to my house. I'm not going to make him a cup of coffee tonight. Just for a simple example, we are using that then as a weapon, and that's not what it's intended for. Okay, boundaries are actually a defensive tool. Okay, if they're appropriately set, they're not going to control, attack, or hurt anyone. Okay, most probably people will get angry because now something's being taken from them. Okay, we use boundaries to, like we said earlier, to protect the treasure that is ours. So saying no to adults who are responsible for getting their own needs met, right, when they're expecting you to do things they can do, may cause discomfort, right? But they may have to look somewhere else, okay? But it doesn't cause an injury, okay? You are not going to injure them or wound them deeply just because you say no. Okay, so obviously this is also a contextual thing, but most of the time it's more a ego injury than anything else. So setting boundaries means that I'm angry. Okay. Anger tells us that our boundaries have been violated. When we get angry at people or we get frustrated or we feel that feeling inside, it's a result of our reluctance to set boundaries and wishing that we had. Okay, the more biblical our boundaries are, the less anger we're going to experience. So you are more in control then of your life and values. So don't get mad, and don't get even, but just set a healthy boundary so that you don't have to feel that internal conflict. So myth 6 is when I set boundaries, it injures me. Okay. An inability to accept others' boundaries can indicate a problem in taking responsibility. Okay. Some people become so accustomed to others rescuing them that they begin to believe that their well-being is someone else's problem. And we can see this a lot in counseling, if there's been learned helplessness or they've been enabled by others. They often feel let down and unloved when they aren't bailed out of trouble. or somebody hasn't come to rescue them. And so they don't accept responsibility for their lives. Okay, so if you want to have others respect your boundaries, right, then you must be willing to respect the boundaries of others. Okay, so these people haven't learned yet to set their limits, but actually setting boundaries for them can actually help them to start taking responsibility. Okay, and then number 7 is one of the biggest myths, is that I'm going to be guilty of something. Okay, it makes you feel guilty when you have to say no to somebody. Okay, and what do we do? What do we owe to anyone who's been loving towards us? Right? Oh no, man, nothing except to love them. Okay, so the idea is just because we have received something, we owe something. This is a problem of non-existent debt. So if somebody does something for you and you feel like you need to do something back for them all the time, and there's a guilt in that, that's not healthy. Okay, so if we receive love or money or time or anything that makes us feel now obligated to reciprocate that with a gift or something, then there's something not right in the way that we are perceiving. Okay, so a gift means there's no strings attached. All that's needed is the gratitude. Okay, and so this is also how God views his gift of salvation to us. Right? It cost him his son. He was motivated out of love for us. So our response is to give and to receive and be grateful. Okay, this gratitude for what he has done for us will move us to love others, and then obviously to love others in a healthy way and not out of guilt. Okay, so boundaries, the myth number 8 is boundaries are permanent and I'm afraid of burning my bridges. Okay, your no is always subject to you. Okay, your own boundaries, you own your boundaries, they don't own you. Okay, if you set limits to somebody and they respond maturely and lovingly, you can then negotiate the boundary or even remove the boundary depending on where that relationship is, how healthy the relationship has become, if there was a problem to start off with. Okay, so let's look at the next slide. So what kind of boundaries do we need in our life, right? We need mental, emotional, and physical and spiritual boundaries. Okay, so our mental boundaries are our thoughts, our attitudes, our desires, our talents, all those things that we are responsible for. Emotional, our feelings, giving, receiving love. Physical, our bodies, our material possessions, so that material sphere. And then our spiritual beliefs, values, how we relate to God. Okay, again, purpose of boundaries is to help us establish what is our responsibility, what isn't our responsibility. And also, the first step again to boundaries is to identify them. Some of these boundaries are also linked to our skin. So the skin on your body, what do I allow on my body? Who do I allow to touch my body? How do I take care of my skin, my body? Our words that we speak, right? Especially our no, we have to take responsibility for that. We have to take responsibility for the truth, right? About God, about who we are, being truthful towards others, our time. Sometimes we need to take time away from something because this can be healthy, because we need to rest or we need space. We need to take time off from something. Okay, it's a way of regaining the ownership over an aspect of your life where there's been a loss of control. So it's like taking a step back, having a look at what you need to do in that relationship, in the work environment, wherever it may be, and then making decisions based on that. And then sometimes there's even a geographical boundary you need to put down. So to move away from something that's been harmful, move away from an abusive relationship, or maybe you need to bring about a change in your life. So sometimes we need that distance as well. And an emotional distance as well. Sometimes we need to put up that bit of a rigid boundary just to guard our heart until we can get to a safer place. So then we'll have that emotional distance that we need to put into place. And it just gives the heart time to heal, time to open up again. So other people as well, they are not you, right? They can help you set and keep other boundaries. So if you've got healthy relationships in your life, people you trust, people you love, let them be your like accountability partner with regards to boundaries, helping you set good boundaries, helping you to maintain those boundaries, helping you to enforce those boundaries. Okay, and then also consequences. Setting and enforcing consequences will show people that you're serious about your boundaries, right? Because if there's no consequence for something, right, then it's not really a boundary. So if we look at young adults as well, if parents followed through the threat of, if there's no money, you're going to have to go and work, we can't keep giving you money, but then they never make sure they get that part-time job, or that there's no consequence, the kid's just going to keep on doing what they're doing. And it's the same in the marriage. How many times have we said, if you don't stop drinking, if you don't stop coming home late, if you don't stop hitting me, but there's never a consequence for whatever the behavior might be. Okay, so you cannot be taken seriously if you can't follow through on a consequence that you're putting down. So what are some of the boundary injuries that we have that makes it difficult for us to put down boundaries? So our own sinfulness, right? And there's those areas of our life that we haven't taken control of, that we need to deal with God, okay? Where there's been a withdrawal from boundaries. So either there's been really rigid boundaries put up for us when we were children, and it's a scary thing, right? It looks like it's not something I want to do, so I'm just going to be a free spirit and there's going to be no boundaries, okay, which is not healthy for us either. Where there's hostility against boundaries, almost in the same category, where that limit makes everything rise up in you and go, no, I can't accept no. That just, I can't do it, okay? So you're hostile. If there's been over control in your life, you're also going to have hostility against boundaries. If you've had over controlling parents, if you've got an over controlling spouse, if your work environment is over controlling, it's going to make you not able to put down a good boundary. If there's been a lack of limits, so growing up as a child, you had inconsistent or neglectful parenting, and there weren't proper limits put down for you. You don't understand what that is. It's the same with the inconsistent limits. Then you can do something, then you're not allowed to do something. Then that's allowed, and then it's not allowed. So where's the benchmark? And then obviously when there's been trauma, there's been abuse, there've been violations, we're not going to know what a healthy boundary is. And then obviously our own character traits, those things that we've come to believe about ourselves, our core beliefs, maybe something that's just developed through conception, that's been transferred, our DNA, that's going to stand in the way. And sometimes, so let's look at boundaries that are put down by authority figures. Maybe we were meant to be leaders, and so being put in a place where we put down all the time, or there's got to be a submission all the time, and something rises up. Sometimes it's not rebelliousness. Sometimes it might be something that God's putting you, that you need to develop in that sphere to make you a better leader or to make you a better person. So it might not always be that people are against you. It might be that God is working on your own character traits to get you to a place where you need to be, and that you can use those changes that He's made in your life for whatever your destiny is, whatever He wants to unleash. And so let's just look at boundary problems, right? So when we look at boundary problems, right, we can look at these different areas. So these are often related also to our attachment behaviors, growing up, our caregivers, the relationship we had with them, how we experienced them, with their love bonds or fear bonds. And so we develop in our relationships with others. So maybe if you look at this, you can identify which one you are. So compliance can't say no, controllers can't hear no, and non-responsives can't say yes, and avoidance can't hear. Okay, yes. All right. So let's just break this down. So compliance often will say yes to the bad. Okay, so parents need to teach their children to be able to say no. Okay, otherwise they set them up to be controlled and manipulated, and it's going to handicap them. Okay, because it's going to put them into a life of compliance to others. When there are indistinct boundaries, they're just going to melt into whatever people expect of them. So it's almost like they become chameleons. They conform to society. They try and blend in. They don't want to cause conflict. So they conform even if it's harmful to them. They obey even if it's harmful to them. They're compliant even if it's harmful. So it can also keep us from refusing evil in our life, especially if we cannot guard our hearts, when it comes to even abusive or controlling relationships. Sometimes compliance also have an over strict critical conscience, right? They condemn themselves for things that God won't condemn them for. They beat up on themselves all the time about things, especially when they say no, or especially when they've had to set a limit. So let me just get my place here. And they're often afraid to confront that critical inner parent. So we know with transactional analysis, we've got the parent, the adult, and the child, and we all have those ego states, right? And we've got that critical parent from childhood, maybe, that was always pointing fingers at us, making us feel guilty. And sometimes we need to get over that. We need to deal with that internal critical parent. And we need to also distinguish between biblical compliance and what we've been discussing here, right? Because compliance should come from compassion from the inside, not being compliant on the outside and feeling like it's a sacrifice, right? Where you're resentful and you're frustrated about it. So that internal no will totally negate the external yes. And God is after our hearts, like we spoke about earlier, wants us to be authentic. So when we take on too many responsibilities, also, we're violating our own boundaries as well as our bodies, because we know what huge amounts of stress can do to us when we take on too much. So let's look at avoidance. Avoidance say no to the good, right? They often have an inability to ask for help. We must be able to recognize our own needs and let others in to help us, right? This is healthy. But what avoidance do is they withdraw when they are in need and they don't ask for support. They have a sense that they need to do everything alone, even if there is help available to them. And this could be linked to, just having a childhood where there's been neglectful or inconsistent parenting, where you've felt like I have to take care of myself, nobody is there. That's the message that we have. And avoidance also find it difficult to open up to God and others. Okay, somewhere they got the message that their problems, their wants, and their needs are not important. They are bad, or they are destructive, or they're not necessary. So they don't need to express that, right? So it's not a good thing. So with controllers, right, they don't respect the boundaries of others, right? They don't respect the limit of others, and they often resist taking responsibility for their own lives by controlling the lives of others. So even if, we've been through abuse and now we get married and we end up in a relationship and we become controlling, where everything around us needs to be controlled. We want that because it makes us feel safe. It makes us feel like we're in control. But then we actually can also become an abuser in that environment without actually realizing it. And so when control is used to motivate others to carry loads, right, that God didn't intend for them to, it means that you're taking your knapsack and you're putting it on somebody else to carry your load and their load, and you're actually creating that burden when it's supposed to be shared. Okay, so that's controllers also. So compliance and avoidance can also be controllers, right? So if we do a favor for someone in a hope that by being loving, that we're going to be loved in turn, right? There's a hidden need that we're trying to get met in that relationship. So again, it comes back to authenticity. And often that other person is going to feel the wrath of not having that need met in return, right? And I mean, you could wait for years if that's your modus of operandi, so that you're caring for somebody in a way that you're hoping that at some point they're going to care back, care for you. And that's like putting a price tag on a relationship. Um, and you're hurting them because they don't know what's expected of them. And so you're reacting out of that all the time, but they don't know what the motive is. They don't know what it is that they're supposed to be getting or giving to you that you're not receiving. And, controllers are isolated as well because people stay with them out of fear or guilt or dependency. They rarely feel that they're loved. They fear abandonment, and often some of their behaviors are used to trap people into that relationship to keep people close, consciously or unconsciously, right? If we look at non-responsives, they don't hear the needs of others. So there's a lack of attention to responsibilities of love. Okay, they exhibit the opposite. Okay, Proverbs 3 verse 27 says, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to act." So we are responsible to care for others. We shouldn't hold that back. And obviously there needs to be limits, but if God has placed people in your life to care for, who are we to withhold that from them? Think of a husband or a wife that knows that their spouse likes them to do a certain thing or wants them to do a certain thing. It's been communicated, but then they constantly or purposely refuse to do that, right? That's an example of that. And there are two groups. There are those with a critical spirit to others' needs, right? So there's projection there as well. They hate being incomplete in themselves, so they ignore the needs of others. And there are those that are so absorbed with their own desires and needs that they exclude others. And this is really a form of narcissism. So controllers and non-responsives have a hard time looking past themselves. They see others as responsible for their struggles or are on the lookout for somebody to care for them. So they will often gravitate to somebody that doesn't have healthy boundaries, because then they're going to take on too much responsibility in the relationship looking after them, right? So compliant avoidance then will often look for someone to repair, right? They will end up with a controller or non-responsive, because they're now looking as well to externally focus. So caring for somebody else instead of dealing with what they need to deal with. So just looking at two types of boundaries, functional and relational, right? A person's ability to complete a task, project, or job is a functional boundary. So it's linked to our performance, discipline, initiative, planning. So that's like our work identity, our ministry, whatever it is we do that's related to our tasks that we need to do. And then we have the relational boundary, the ability to speak to others with whom we are in relationship. Okay, and we know that even these behaviors play out in all these different environments. Okay, so a lot of people might have very good functional boundaries. They can get the job done. They know what they need to do, but they're very poor relational ones. They can't perform tasks at high levels of competence. But they're not able to tell a friend that they don't like their chronic lateness. So sorry, that's wrong. If you're able to perform at a very high level, right, in your work environment, but when you've got to say to your friend, look, you're coming late, I don't want you to come so late. Say, for example, you're the boss, you find that really hard to do. So you've got the CEO who functions really highly, but unable to put on healthy boundaries with their employees. Okay, so the reverse can be true, right? You might be able to be very honest with somebody about boundaries or what you expect from them, but you can't get up early to go to work in the morning. You're always late for work. So these play out in different areas. So just to cover two areas quickly is just to look at boundaries and your spouse. I don't want to go into too much depth here because I want to cover this topic at a later stage. So more marriages fail because of poor boundaries than for any other reason. So is this mine, yours, mine, or ours? Okay, and obviously we know that for any relationship to be successful and healthy, you need to be healthy within yourself, okay, before you can try and make other people healthy. So every spouse has duties that they need to perform, okay? So you've got stuff you need to do, your husband's got stuff that he needs to do, and even you can bring your children into that. We'll look at that. When those two become one on the wedding day, they don't lose their identity, right? They're still two individuals with an overlap in the middle, like our circle in the beginning. And so each one is still responsible for their own life, and then there are things that they are responsible to together. So if they trespass on each other's individuality or personhood, right, and try to control the feelings, attitudes, and behaviors, choices, and values of the other, this is when the problems arise. And then we have boundary violations and power struggles in a marriage. So before you get married, that really needs to be clarified. And if you are married and it hasn't been done yet, it's probably time to start doing that. And then if we look at parenting as well, we've got the parents and the children that also have an overlapping circle. There's a certain amount of space that you're going to give your children where they can come in, where there's that togetherness as a family. There needs to be a parental alliance where the parents stand together for the benefit of the children, not to be fighting in front of the children or to be haggling about punishment in front of the children. We need to, as parents, model those healthy relationship boundaries to our kids. So when parents are in agreement, there's a clear boundary. The children know where they stand. There isn't going to be confusion. So this is really where it starts, where we're modeling our boundaries to the children, so they're going to know where the limits are as they get older. And then just quickly to look at the I, thou, I, it relationship. And this is from the theory of Martin Buber. So it's really the vertical and horizontal relationship, right? If we treat people as a thou, like we would treat God, God is what Buber says is the eternal thou, right? We are going to be present, available, intentional, and willing to be authentic and open, and to really share our hearts with people, especially our spouse, or our friends, people that we're close to, okay? We want to be willing to communicate, to be open, to be included. Both are inclusive, and there's an empathetic response, right? We're really listening to hear what the other person is saying. We're really not only listening to respond, but we're listening to what they're saying, right? So that person is then somebody of value. It really mirrors the vertical and horizontal relationship. When we treat somebody as an it, right, we see them as an object. It's something that we can either gain knowledge from or gain experience from. There's something we're going to get from that person. Okay, and they often, I person or I it is often you're going to see that other person as a means to an end. How can I get my needs met through this person, right? So it's very one-sided relationship, and it's an alienating relationship because this type of person is not going to have very many close, authentic relationships. It's going to be quite lonely for them. So this is something we should keep in the back of our mind. How do we treat people? As a thou or a it? Okay. So let's just have a look at what is some of the resistance that we feel, right? Resistance to boundaries. So it's angry reactions, right? People get angry at others for setting boundaries, right? They have character problems. Okay? They're often self-centered and are angry because their wish was not granted or their need wasn't met. Okay, so these are some of the reasons why we don't often set boundaries. And often that anger problem, it's not yours, it's theirs. So this is another thing with boundaries. What is my stuff? What is their stuff? Okay. And then again, we look at the guilt messages, whatever messages that we've internalized around setting boundaries, or if people make us feel guilty for setting boundaries. All right. And then we've got the consequences and counter moves. So you need to figure out what you're getting for the lack of the boundary, right? And what will be the consequence for setting it. So if I don't set the boundary, what am I getting from this relationship that I need? If I do set this boundary, what am I going to lose? I may lose the relationship, but then you need to consider maybe that relationship is worth losing, maybe for a time or completely, if it's not bringing peace, if it's creating constant conflict in your life. So you need to decide, it's kind of that payoff as well, that you have. What am I getting from this? And payoffs are not always good for us. So physical resistance, right? Other people hurt, like we spoke earlier, when we start to set boundaries, and they will feel often a loss of what they're now not getting anymore. And then they respond from that. So if you love that person, it might be difficult to set those boundaries, but it's often necessary and helpful for them, because there's something that needs to change in their life also. And this applies to our children, our spouses, our friends, and other areas, where we need to put those limits down. If we've been enabling people, our limits can actually bring them to a place now to take responsibility. And even if they kick at it in the beginning, right, there's a sense of empowerment that comes when we can take responsibility for our lives. And then if we look at forgiveness and reconciliation, there's often confusion around this, because people feel that they have to give in. If they forgive somebody now, I'm giving into it. But forgiveness is not necessarily reconciliation, right? So we can forgive somebody from our heart to release them and to release ourselves. But if that's not a very good relationship for us, and it's a constant source of pain, we don't need to reconcile. We just have to have our heart clean before God, and then decide for ourselves how much of that relationship we need in our life. Maybe it's going to become just an acquaintance. Hello, how are you? Maybe we're going to cut it off. That is something you work out with God, but you do not necessarily need to reconcile, okay? Because a reconciliation takes two people, and we don't open ourselves up to somebody else unless we see that there's a willingness from their side for the reconciliation, where there's a change of behavior, because there's got to be a changing of direction, right? True repentance is more than just I'm sorry, right? There's got to be, God is our model of how people should treat us. And then let's look at blamers. So, or real needs, right? You may need to set boundaries on people in real need, okay? Because even as counselors, or if you work in ministry or any helping profession, we can't help everybody. Even Moses in the Bible, his father-in-law said, you've got to get people to help you. You cannot be the judge of all these people. There were just too many people coming to him. So sometimes we need to move people on to somebody else if we can't help them, if our plate's overloaded. Because if we are burnt out, we're no good to them, and we're no good to ourselves. So we have to also be able to have our limits there. Blamers, so these also have character problems, right? If they are blaming and demanding what is yours, then they make it sound as though their misery is because of you not giving them something. Okay, so you can listen to the complaints. You can weigh up if that blaming is something you need to take responsibility for, or that you don't need to take responsibility for. And then obviously you can confront them on that. You don't need to carry loads that are not yours to carry. Then again, the pain of others. Others often hurt when we start to set those boundaries. Okay, we've covered that already. So let's go to the internal resistance. This is our second last slide. So with internal resistance, there's the human need, right? Unmet developmental needs are responsible for much of our resistance to boundaries. God did design us to grow up in families that were loving and nurturing and should have had good boundaries, set good limits for us. And so they were supposed to set that template for us, but unfortunately, it's not always there. Okay. Then we've got unresolved grief and loss. We're often unable to set boundaries because the person cannot let go of that person with whom they're fused, especially if there's a codependent or unhealthy relationship. That loss of actually losing that, even though it's good for us, can prevent that. So often we need to just let it go and ask God to help us, in that grieving process and bring something good as a replacement. We look at our internal fears of anger. If angry people make you lose or violate your own boundaries, you probably still have an angry person in your head that you still fear, right? So we looked earlier at that internal parent, that critical voice, or maybe somebody else. If there's somebody angry in your head and you need to deal with that, you need to work through that experience in the past and you need to let go of that so that God can bring healing in that area. And then there's also the fear of unknown, right? Being controlled by others. It's a safe prison. It's very predictable in its harmfulness to us. So it's often easier to just stay in that place than actually going against the control, because setting boundaries and being independent is sometimes more scary because it's unknown and it's hard. Okay, so we know that change is hard. Abraham in Hebrews 11 verse 8 had to leave his people because they weren't good for him. They weren't good for the plan that God had for his life. And so he had to trust God to lead him to a better place. So there's a two-sided nature to boundaries, right? You may lose something, but you may also gain a new life, that's more peaceful and where you have more control. And then again, we look at forgiveness, unforgiveness, right? Forgiveness is hard, right? It means actually letting go of something that someone owes you, right? So you need to forgive so that you can just have that freedom from the past and freedom from the people that have hurt you, that abusive relationship, whatever that might look like. So it's not good to hold on to that. And then the external focus, the external perspective keeps you a victim. It says that you can never be okay until someone else changes, instead of seeing that you actually have the power in your hand to make that change. So you've got to deal with that resistance in order to make the change. And then again, we see with internal resistance that guilt comes up, right? It's that state of internal condemnation, right? It can even come from those early socialization messages that we received, those imposed values on us. There's like this internal standard that we've been taught. And so even with the boundaries, right, this guilt has come up all the time. And I think for a lot of us, that is a problem. Saying no, putting the limits down, it's the guilt that's there. So we need to deal with that. Then there's also the abandonment fear, again, with the internal resistance. If there's no secure bonding, right, boundary setting will be frightening because of the abandonment fear. So if that's not a healthy relationship, we don't feel safe already, we're going to be quite fearful to put that down. And I think especially for women, because for women, our core fear is loss of relationship. We don't want to lose the relationship. So it's harder for us then to actually put that down and actually maintain the boundary. And then very simply, right, it's not easy. Jesus did warn in this world we would have trouble. But when we can start doing things the way God intends for us to do it, there is going to be trouble inside and outside because things are going to need to change. And even though doing it the right way is difficult and there is resistance, it's actually a good sign because it means it's something that needs to happen. So we need to just persevere with those changes that need to take place. So just lastly, to give you some key areas just to look at if you're establishing boundaries with yourself, right? First of all, look at some of the symptoms in your life. What have you been struggling with? What are the areas that are causing the most problems? Have a look at what the roots are. So think about, where did that come from? Where did it start? Is it a lack of training? Is it rewarded destructiveness? So that would also be linked to our parenting. Is there a distorted need Is there fear of relationship? Are there unmet emotional hungers? Are we living under the law? That comes to all those, the guilt myth as well. And then, is it covering emotional hurt? Then we need to see, what is the boundary conflict? Why can't I set this boundary? What is going on here? You need to analyze that. You need to have a look at who needs to take ownership. Do I need to take ownership? Does somebody else need to take ownership in this area to deal with what needs to be dealt with? Do I need to set that limit for that person to take ownership? And then you need to have a look at, what do you need to do in order to set these relationships right? So how do you begin? You address the real need, right? In the beginning, it's going to be hard, but you're going to allow yourself to fail, even at setting those boundaries. You're going to listen to empathic feedback from others. So let them speak into your life. Let them tell you where you need to be strengthened. Allow that. Welcome consequences as a teacher, right? Because consequences train us, they discipline us, and they teach us for the next situation as well, because the next time we're going to know better. And then have the support that you need in your life. So surround yourself with people who are loving and supportive that can help you when you need to enforce those boundaries.